threatened Canada. They were foolish to do it. And so I said, we're going to stop all negotiations with Canada right now until they straighten out their act.
U.S. President Donald Trump repeating his rhetoric over Canada becoming the 51st state, days after saying trade negotiations between the two countries have ended.
The rising tensions U.S. President Donald Trump's contentious relationship with Canada has been simmering for years, but in June 2025, it reached a boiling point. It all began with a simple declaration: we're done talking. In a dramatic and unexpected move, Trump halted trade negotiations with Canada's closest neighbor, a decision that would set off a chain reaction in international trade relations. Trump's ire wasn't rooted solely in trade deals or taxes. It was something more provocative. Canada should be the 51st state, he said, a statement that shocked the political landscape. This was no ordinary diplomatic misstep. It was a brazen assertion of dominance that would dominate headlines and set the stage for a new phase of negotiations between the two nations. The immediate trigger for this dramatic escalation was Canada's implementation of a new digital services tax, DST, scheduled to go into effect on July 1st. This 3% levy was aimed squarely at tech giants like Google, Amazon, and Meta, and it quickly became a flashpoint in the trade conflict. Investors like Kevin O'Leary criticized the tax, calling it a desperate measure driven by Canada's worsening fiscal crisis. According to the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Office, the DST could generate nearly $7 billion over 5 years. But for Trump, the issue wasn't just economic. It was a symbol of Canada's increasing willingness to challenge U.S. economic hegemony. The tax was long in the making. Announced in 2019 and passed into law in 2024, its timing was critical. With trade negotiations between the U.S. and Canada at a standstill, Trump saw it as an affront to U.S. interests, something that needed immediate retaliation. The president's message was clear: if Canada moved forward with this tax, it would face tariffs on its key exports, including steel, aluminum, and dairy, within the week. And Trump didn't stop there. He seized the opportunity to revisit Canada's long-standing supply management system, particularly in dairy, poultry, and eggs. Despite the fact that the system was preserved in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, Trump now called it unfair, accusing Canada of exploiting the U.S. market without paying its dues. Trump's rhetoric, while provocative, was a strategic maneuver, a way to throw Canada's leaders off balance. His move was not simply about punishing Canada for its tax policies. It was an attempt to use a diplomatic hammer to force a more favorable trade deal. By suggesting that Canada should become the 51st state, Trump blurred the line between economic negotiation and political domination. Critics dismissed it as rhetorical theater, but for Trump it was an essential part of his strategy to assert American dominance in the trade arena. As Trump ramped up his rhetoric, Prime Minister Mark Carney found himself in a difficult position. Carney, who had steered Canada through a complex set of negotiations with the European Union, knew that Canada could not afford to back down. But the growing trade tensions were beginning to have a tangible impact on Canada's economy. Industrial towns were already reeling from supply chain disruptions, and small businesses that depended on cross-border trade with the U.S. were facing rising costs and falling demand. Carney understood that his next moves would not only determine Canada's trade future, but also its political stability. The struggle for leverage. As President Trump continued to escalate the rhetoric, the stakes for Canada became even higher. Behind the bluster, there was a clear message. The U.S. was willing to impose tariffs on Canadian goods unless Canada backed down on its digital services tax and other trade demands. For Trump, it wasn't just about the economic policies themselves. It was about proving a point, that America was the dominant force in this relationship, and Canada had to fall in line. However, Prime Minister Carney wasn't simply going to capitulate. Having already secured a long-term economic partnership with Europe, Carney was starting to shift Canada's strategic direction away from over-reliance on the U.S. He knew that Canada's position in these negotiations wasn't as weak as Trump might think. Europe's growing interest in Canadian infrastructure bonds and trade partnerships gave Carney the leverage he needed to resist Trump's demands. Still, the political pressure was mounting. Carney faced growing calls from Canadian business leaders and trade unions to take a firm stance. The manufacturing sector, already struggling due to tariffs on steel and aluminum, was starting to buckle under the weight of these new trade restrictions. Statistics Canada reported that layoffs in the sector had hit a 5-year high by May, and small towns along the border, like Windsor, Ontario, were feeling the effects of stalled supply chains and idled plants. Carney had to act, and fast. But what was his strategy? Behind closed doors, Ottawa was considering a range of countermeasures, including retaliatory tariffs on key U.S. agricultural products and aerospace components. Carney's team was clear. Canada wasn't afraid to engage in a trade war if necessary, but they preferred a diplomatic resolution. The July 21st deadline became crucial, as it was the date when new tariffs would be triggered if no deal was reached by then. At the same time, Carney was trying to keep the lines of communication open with Washington. He understood that an all-out trade war with the U.S. would be disastrous for both countries, especially in the midst of a global economic slowdown. Still, Trump's campaign to finalize 90 trade deals in 90 days, with its aggressive tactics and vague promises, was not making things easier. While the White House had hoped that this deadline would yield quick results, the reality was that most of these deals were either framework agreements or simple announcements, with little to no concrete details. Deals with China and the UK, which were trumpeted as major victories, were hardly finalized, and no deal had been reached with Canada by the July 9th deadline. With the clock ticking down, Carney and his team continued to meet with U.S. officials, led by Ambassador Kristen Hillman and U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer. However, progress had been slow, and the mood was tense. Carney's diplomatic strategy was becoming increasingly clear. If the U.S. refused to back down on tariffs, Canada would impose its own countermeasures, targeting industries such as aerospace and agriculture. But the deeper issue wasn't just about tariffs. It was about the future of North American trade. Trump's hardline stance was not just a challenge to Canada's economy, but to the very fabric of the continent's economic integration. If Canada capitulated to Trump's demands, it would signal to the rest of the world that the U.S. could dictate terms to its closest allies. Carney was determined to prevent that from happening, but it wasn't just about protecting Canada's sovereignty. It was about setting a precedent for how the U.S. should treat its trade partners. In Washington, Trump was facing his own set of challenges. His 90 Deals in 90 Days campaign, designed to secure a series of bilateral agreements and reassert U.S. dominance on the global stage, was faltering. With less than 2 weeks remaining before the deadline, Trump had little to show for his aggressive approach. The tariffs on Canadian goods were still in place, and negotiations with other key partners, including the EU and China, were far from finalized. As Trump's re-election campaign loomed, the stakes became even higher. The pressure to deliver on his trade promises was intensifying, and he knew that his political future depended on securing victories that could be framed as wins for the American people. But the reality was that his approach, which was focused on using tariffs as leverage, was starting to backfire. Approval ratings for Trump's economic policies had dropped, and his once loyal allies like Elon Musk were now publicly criticizing his economic agenda. In Canada, the political situation was similarly fraught. Carney was under pressure from all sides. He had to balance the demands of business leaders, unions, and the public, all while trying to protect Canada's interests on the global stage. The Canadian government wasn't giving up its agricultural protections, particularly the supply management system that had long been a point of contention between the two countries. But the digital services tax was a different matter. Canadian officials privately acknowledged that there might be room for flexibility on the DST if it led to a broader deal that could address the wider trade issues. As the July 21st deadline loomed, both countries were preparing for a confrontation. Trump was preparing to follow through on his tariff threats if Canada didn't give in to his demands. Carney, on the other hand, was laying the groundwork for a new strategy that would allow Canada to reduce its dependence on the U.S. and explore new trade partnerships, especially with Europe. The next few weeks would determine not just the future of U.S.-Canada relations, but also the broader trajectory of global trade in the coming years. The aftermath and the future of U.S.-Canada relations. As the July 9th deadline passed with no substantial progress in the negotiations, the uncertainty hanging over the U.S.-Canada trade relationship reached a critical point. President Trump, despite his bluster and threats of further tariffs, had failed to secure the 90 deals in 90 days that he had promised. Instead, he faced a situation where the clock was ticking and his administration was under growing scrutiny. In the eyes of many, the trade war with Canada was a self-inflicted wound that not only undermined U.S. interests but also strained relations with a critical ally. For Canada, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Prime Minister Carney's calculated approach to the crisis was starting to bear fruit. While Trump's aggressive tactics were generating political heat in the U.S., Carney was positioning Canada as a more independent and resilient player on the world stage. Canada had already secured a partnership with Europe, and that gave Carney the leverage he needed to navigate the standoff with Washington. The internal pressure in Canada was mounting as well. Layoffs in manufacturing sectors were hitting hard, and smaller towns like Windsor, Ontario, where industries relied on cross-border trade, were beginning to feel the consequences of stalled supply chains and rising costs. Carney's government knew that Canada couldn't afford to wait forever for the U.S. to come to the negotiating table. Therefore, the July 21st deadline was critical. If no deal was reached, new tariffs would be imposed, including on U.S. steel and aluminum, as well as agricultural goods like dairy and aerospace components. In the face of these challenges, Carney made a bold decision. Behind closed doors, Ottawa was already preparing to implement countermeasures in case Trump followed through on his threats. Carney's strategy was clear. He was willing to engage in a trade war, but only if it became absolutely necessary. He wanted to protect Canadian workers and industries, but he was also looking to create long-term alternatives to U.S. dominance in Canada's trade policy. The deeper challenge, however, was the growing realization that the nature of the U.S.-Canada relationship was fundamentally changing. No longer could Canada afford to be the passive partner in the trade equation. With Europe becoming an increasingly important trading partner, Canada's economic priorities were shifting, and its dependence on the U.S. was diminishing. This shift wasn't just economic, it was political. As the U.S. administration continued to rely on unilateral tariffs as a negotiating tool, Canada was embracing a more balanced approach to international relations, one where it could no longer rely solely on its southern neighbor for trade and economic security. In Washington, the political pressure on Trump was intensifying. His 90 deals in 90 days campaign was unraveling, with very few concrete agreements to show for all the promises and threats. The tariffs on Canadian exports remained, and with little progress in negotiations with other key global partners, the situation looked increasingly grim. While Trump continued to frame his trade policy as a win for American workers, the reality was that the economic consequences of his tariffs were beginning to affect U.S. consumers, businesses, and workers. Inflation was climbing, and experts were warning that the full impact of the tariffs wouldn't be felt until later in the year, making it harder for Trump to claim victories ahead of the upcoming midterm elections. Moreover, the broader global economic landscape was shifting in ways that even Trump's administration couldn't ignore. China, despite temporarily agreeing to suspend retaliatory measures, was still pushing back against the U.S.'s semiconductor export restrictions, signaling that the trade tensions between the two countries were far from resolved. Meanwhile, the European Union, while engaging in negotiations, was growing increasingly frustrated with the U.S.'s approach. The EU had made clear that if the U.S. didn't relent on its tariffs, they would take action through the World Trade Organization, WTO. This created a situation where the U.S. was facing challenges not only from its neighbors, but from key allies and trading partners around the world. Back in Canada, Carney's diplomatic efforts were beginning to show their value. With European investment increasing and trade partnerships flourishing, Canada had options. It didn't need to be solely dependent on the U.S. The government's decision to align with Europe was more than just a trade maneuver. It was a declaration of independence from Washington's heavy-handed tactics. This growing divergence in trade priorities was transforming Canada's relationship with the U.S., and by July 21st, the outcome of the negotiations would have profound implications not only for the two countries, but for the global trading system. The potential for a resolution still remained, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the U.S.-Canada trade dynamic had entered a new phase. Carney's stance was resolute. Canada would not be bullied by the U.S., and it would not be dragged into a damaging trade war without exhausting all diplomatic options. As the negotiations continued, Canada's position was strengthened by its alliances with Europe and other global powers, and the U.S., despite its political rhetoric, found itself on the back foot. Ultimately, the July 21st deadline came and went with no comprehensive trade deal between the U.S. and Canada. Instead, both countries entered a new era of uneasy diplomacy, one where economic leverage, political messaging, and global alliances would shape the future of their relationship. Trump's attempts to dominate the trade negotiations with Canada had failed, but the broader lesson was clear. The U.S. could no longer take its closest allies for granted. In the end, whether or not a final deal was reached between the two countries, it was clear that the U.S.-Canada relationship would never be the same. Canada had recalibrated its trade priorities, no longer relying solely on the U.S., and Trump's aggressive tactics had pushed the two countries onto a more complex and uncertain path. The global trade order, too, had shifted as nations around the world began to reevaluate their strategies in the face of Trump's unilateral approach to diplomacy. While the future of U.S.-Canada trade remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The dynamics of the North American relationship were undergoing a profound transformation.